The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its dark waters reflecting the dim lights of the USS Nimitz as it cut through the waves under a moonless sky. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the flight deck, her fingers gripping the safety rail so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she stared down at the churning water 30 feet below. Sarah had always been different from the other naval officers. While her colleagues focused on promotions and glory, she carried a weight that nobody else could see. 3 months ago, she had received the letter that changed everything. Her younger brother, Tommy, the only family she had left after their parents died in a car crash 5 years earlier, had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months to live, maybe 8 if he was lucky. She had requested emergency leave immediately, but the Navy had denied it. The carrier was in the middle of a critical mission in the South China Sea, and they couldn't spare any personnel. Sarah understood the rules, but understanding didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Every day that passed was another day she wasn't there to hold Tommy's hand, to tell him everything would be okay, even if they both knew it wasn't true. The flight deck was mostly empty at this hour. Most of the crew was either sleeping or on duty below deck. Sarah had volunteered for the night watch, knowing she couldn't sleep anyway. The nightmares had started 3 weeks ago. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tommy as a little boy, running toward her with scraped knees after falling off his bicycle. She would wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for her phone to call him, only to remember that it was the middle of the night back home, and he needed his rest. Earlier that evening, she had received another message from Tommy's doctor. The treatment wasn't working as well as they had hoped. Tommy was asking for her constantly, wondering why his big sister wasn't there when he needed her most. Sarah had locked herself in a storage closet and cried for 20 minutes, something she hadn't done since she was 12 years old. As she stood on the deck, Sarah pulled out her phone and looked at the last photo Tommy had sent her. He was sitting in his hospital bed, smiling weakly at the camera, his once thick brown hair now completely gone from chemotherapy. He had written a message with the photo. "Don't worry about me, sis. I'm tougher than I look. But I miss you." The wind grew stronger, and Sarah felt herself swaying slightly. She had been standing there for over an hour, lost in her thoughts. The rational part of her mind knew that jumping wouldn't solve anything. Tommy would be devastated if something happened to her. But the emotional part, the part that was slowly being crushed by helplessness and grief, whispered that maybe it would be better this way. Maybe Tommy wouldn't have to watch her struggle with the knowledge that she had failed him when he needed her most. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The salt air filled her lungs as she remembered the promise she had made to Tommy when their parents died. She had sworn she would always be there for him, that nothing would ever separate them again. She had kept that promise for 5 years. Putting his needs before her own, working extra shifts to pay for his college tuition, being both sister and parent when he needed guidance. But now, when it mattered most, she was trapped 3,000 miles away on a floating metal island, watching her brother die through text messages and phone calls that never lasted long enough. The guilt was eating her alive, making it impossible to focus on her duties, impossible to pretend that everything was normal. The sound of footsteps behind her made Sarah open her eyes. She turned to see Commander Rodriguez approaching, his expression concerned. He had been watching her closely for the past few weeks, noticing how distracted she had become, how she barely ate in the mess hall, how she jumped whenever someone spoke to her unexpectedly. "Chen, what are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "You should have gone off duty an hour ago." Sarah straightened up, trying to compose herself. "Just getting some fresh air, sir. Couldn't sleep." Commander Rodriguez studied her face in the dim light. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with invisible weight. He had read her file, knew about her family situation, and had tried to pull strings to get her emergency leave approved. But the orders from above had been clear. The mission took priority over personal matters. "You know, Chen, I've been in the Navy for 22 years, he said, moving to stand beside her at the rail. I've seen a lot of good sailors struggle with things beyond their control. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against enemy forces." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him everything, to admit that she was falling apart, that every day felt like torture. But military training had taught her to keep her emotions in check, to soldier on regardless of personal pain. "I'm fine, sir," she managed to say, though her voice cracked slightly. Commander Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, watching the waves crash against the side of the ship. "My father died while I was deployed in Afghanistan," he said finally. "Heart attack. By the time I got the message, he had already been buried for 3 days. I spent months angry at the Navy, angry at myself, angry at God. But eventually I realized that being angry wasn't bringing him back, and it wasn't helping anyone else either." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "It's different, sir. My brother, he's only 22. He's scared. And he needs me. And I'm stuck here playing war games while he's dying alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with pain and frustration. Commander Rodriguez had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his chest tighten with sympathy. "He's not alone, Chen. He has nurses, doctors, friends, and he has you, even if you're not physically there. Sometimes being strong for someone means doing your duty even when every fiber of your being wants to run to them." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, frustrated with herself for crying in front of a superior officer. "I made him a promise, sir. When our parents died, I promised I would always be there for him. And now, when it matters most, I'm breaking that promise." "No, you're not," Commander Rodriguez said firmly. "You're serving your country, following orders, doing what needs to be done. That takes a different kind of strength, but it's strength nonetheless. Your brother knows that." They stood in silence for several minutes, the sound of the ocean providing a steady background rhythm to their thoughts. Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. It didn't solve anything, but knowing that someone understood, someone cared, made the burden feel slightly less overwhelming. "Go get some rest, Chen," Commander Rodriguez said eventually. "That's an order, and if you need to talk, my door is always open." Sarah nodded, grateful for his kindness. "Thank you, sir." As she turned to go, Commander Rodriguez called her name. "Chen, your brother is lucky to have you as a sister. Don't forget that." Sarah made her way below deck, passing through the narrow corridors that had become as familiar as her childhood home. She stopped outside her quarters, her hand on the door handle, and pulled out her phone one more time. There was a new message from Tommy, sent just 20 minutes ago despite the late hour back home. "Can't sleep. Thinking about that time we went camping when I was 10 and you made up stories about the stars. I still remember every one of them. Love you, sis." Sarah smiled through her tears and typed back quickly. "Love you too, little brother. Dream about those stars for both of us." She slipped into her quarters and sat on the edge of her narrow bunk, still holding her phone. Tomorrow would bring another day of trying to focus on her duties while her heart was breaking. Another day of pretending she was okay when she felt like she was drowning. But maybe, with Commander Rodriguez's words echoing in her mind, she could find a way to be strong for both herself and Tommy. The ship continued its steady course through the dark Pacific waters, carrying Sarah further from the person who needed her most, but also carrying her toward a destiny she couldn't yet imagine. In 12 hours, everything would change in ways that none of them could have predicted. The ocean held secrets beneath its surface, and one of those secrets was about to surface with consequences that would test every ounce of courage Sarah had left. As she finally drifted off to sleep, still fully clothed and clutching her phone, Sarah dreamed of stars and stories, of a little boy with scraped knees running toward her with absolute trust that his big sister would make everything better. She had no way of knowing that her promise to always be there for Tommy was about to be tested in the most extraordinary way imaginable. The alarm that woke Sarah at 0500 hours felt different from the usual wake-up call. It was sharper, more urgent, cutting through her restless sleep like a knife. She had been dreaming about Tommy again, but this time the dream had been different. Instead of the usual nightmares, she had seen him healthy and laughing, telling her that everything would work out the way it was supposed to. Sarah rolled out of her bunk and quickly dressed in her uniform, muscle memory taking over as her mind struggled to fully wake up. The corridors were busier than usual for this early in the morning, with crew members moving with purpose toward their stations. Something was happening, though nobody seemed to know exactly what. In the mess hall, rumors flew faster than the coffee being poured into white ceramic mugs. Some said they had received new orders from headquarters. Others whispered about unusual sonar readings that had been detected during the night shift. Sarah grabbed a cup of coffee and a piece of toast, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to handle anything more substantial. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, the communications officer, approached her table with a grim expression. "Chen, you're needed in the communication center immediately. We've got a situation developing." Sarah followed Walsh through the maze of corridors that led to the heart of the ship's communication systems. The room was buzzing with activity, screens flickering with incoming data, radio operators speaking in hushed, urgent tones into their headsets. Admiral Morrison stood in the center of it all, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied a map spread across the central table. "Chen, good, you're here," Admiral Morrison said without looking up. "We've got a delicate situation on our hands. Intelligence has confirmed the presence of a Chinese submarine operating in this area without authorization. They're running silent, but our sonar picked up their signature about 2 hours ago." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Unauthorized foreign submarines in these waters could mean anything from espionage to preparation for military action. "What are our orders, sir?" "We're maintaining our current course and monitoring their position," Admiral Morrison replied. "But there's something else. We intercepted some of their communications before they went completely silent. Their submarine is experiencing technical difficulties with their life support systems. They have approximately 8 hours of breathable air remaining." The gravity of the situation began to sink in. An enemy submarine in distress presented a complex moral and political dilemma. Military protocol dictated caution when dealing with foreign vessels, especially ones operating without authorization. But maritime law and basic human decency demanded that ships assist vessels in distress, regardless of nationality. "Sir, are we planning to offer assistance?" Sarah asked, knowing the answer would be complicated. Admiral Morrison rubbed his forehead, a gesture she had seen him make whenever he was wrestling with difficult decisions. "That's where it gets tricky, Chen. Officially, we can't acknowledge their presence without creating an international incident. Unofficially, we can't let people die when we have the capability to help them." Throughout the morning, tension on the carrier continued to build. The crew went about their duties with professional efficiency, but everyone could feel the weight of the decision hanging over them. Sarah found herself thinking about the Chinese sailors trapped beneath the waves, wondering if they had families at home, if there were people who loved them waiting for their safe return. During her lunch break, Sarah called Tommy using the ship's communication system. He sounded weaker than he had just a few days earlier, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctors had started him on a new experimental treatment, but the side effects were brutal. "I keep having this weird dream," Tommy told her, his words slightly slurred from the medication. "You're underwater, but you can breathe, and you're helping people. It doesn't make any sense, but it feels so real." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "That is weird, little brother. Maybe it means I'm supposed to be a marine biologist instead of a naval officer. Tommy managed a weak laugh. Maybe. Or maybe it means you're going to do something really important soon. I always knew you were destined for great things, Sarah. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the empty communication room, staring at the phone in her hands. Tommy's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the knowledge of the submarine crisis developing just miles below their position. She had always believed in signs, in the idea that the universe sometimes provided guidance when people needed it most. That evening, Admiral Morrison called a meeting with his senior officers. Sarah wasn't technically senior enough to attend, but Lieutenant Commander Walsh had specifically requested her presence due to her expertise in underwater rescue operations. She had specialized training in deep-sea recovery missions, something that might become relevant if the situation escalated. The meeting was held in the Admiral's private conference room, a space that felt more intimate than the usual military briefing areas. Charts covered every wall, showing ocean depths, current patterns, and the precise location of both the carrier and the distressed submarine. "Gentlemen and lady," Admiral Morrison began, nodding toward Sarah, "we find ourselves in an unprecedented situation. The Chinese submarine is now down to approximately 4 hours of breathable air. Their captain has begun sending distress signals on international emergency frequencies." Captain Hayes, the ship's executive officer, leaned forward in his chair. "Sir, what's the official position from headquarters?" "Headquarters is still determining the appropriate response," Admiral Morrison replied carefully. "In the meantime, we're authorized to monitor the situation and prepare for potential rescue operations if circumstances warrant." Sarah realized that this was military speak for "help them, but don't get caught doing it." The political implications of an American carrier rescuing a Chinese submarine crew could be enormous, but the moral implications of letting them die were even greater. "What would a rescue operation look like?" Sarah asked, surprising herself by speaking up in a room full of senior officers. Admiral Morrison turned to her with an expression that suggested he had been hoping someone would ask that question. "It would require someone with specialized underwater training to coordinate with their crew and assist in evacuation procedures. The risks would be significant, both to the rescue personnel and to the broader mission." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Sarah felt her pulse quickening as she realized why she had been invited to this meeting. Her specialized training, her experience with underwater rescue operations, her current emotional state. It all added up to make her the logical choice for an incredibly dangerous mission. "Sir," Sarah said slowly, "I volunteer to lead any rescue operation that might be authorized." Lieutenant Commander Walsh looked at her with concern. "Chen, you're not thinking clearly. This isn't a standard rescue operation. This is an unauthorized mission to save enemy personnel. If something goes wrong, the Navy will disavow any knowledge of the operation." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I understand the risks, sir. But I also understand what it means to feel helpless when someone needs saving. Those sailors didn't choose to be in this situation any more than I chose to be separated from my dying brother." Admiral Morrison studied her face carefully. "Chen, your personal situation doesn't disqualify you from this mission, but it also can't be the primary motivation for accepting it. Are you certain you can maintain professional objectivity under these circumstances?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "My brother taught me something important about being strong for others, even when you're scared, maybe especially when you're scared." The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions about timing, equipment, and contingency plans. If the rescue operation went forward, it would have to happen under cover of darkness, with minimal crew involvement and with complete deniability if questioned by international authorities. As the officers filed out of the conference room, Admiral Morrison asked Sarah to stay behind. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the impending decision hanging heavy between them. You know, Chen, in 30 years of military service, I've never faced a choice quite like this one, Admiral Morrison said finally. The safe decision is to do nothing and let politics sort itself out. But sometimes the safe decision isn't the right decision. Sarah nodded, understanding that he was sharing something deeply personal with her. My father always told me that courage isn't the absence of fear, sir. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Sarah replied softly. I just hope I inherited some of that wisdom. As night fell over the Pacific, Sarah stood once again at the edge of the flight deck, but this time her perspective had completely changed. Instead of looking down at the dark water as an escape from her pain, she was looking at it as a pathway to purpose. Somewhere beneath those waves, 8 Chinese sailors were running out of time, and she might be their only hope for survival. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 24 hours earlier, she had been contemplating ending her own life because she felt powerless to save someone she loved. Now she was preparing to risk that same life to save complete strangers. Tommy's dream suddenly made perfect sense. She was about to go underwater to help people, just as he had envisioned. Sarah pulled out her phone and typed a message to Tommy. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, little brother. Keep fighting, and I'll keep fighting too. Some battles are worth everything we have to give. She hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital void that connected her to home. In a few hours, she would slip silently off the carrier and into the ocean, not as an escape from responsibility, but as an embrace of a responsibility larger than herself. The submarine was waiting in the darkness below, its crew clinging to hope as their oxygen slowly ran out. Sarah had no way of knowing that this mission would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways that would ripple out for years to come. All she knew was that Tommy had been right in his dream. She was destined to do something important, something that would require every ounce of courage and strength she possessed. The ocean that had seemed like an enemy just hours before was about to become the stage for the most crucial performance of her life. At exactly 2300 hours, Sarah Chen slipped silently over the side of the USS Nimitz into the black Pacific waters. She wore a specialized diving suit equipped with advanced life support systems and underwater communication equipment. The water was shockingly cold despite her thermal protection, but her training kicked in immediately, helping her regulate her breathing and orient herself in the darkness. The submarine lay 180 feet below the surface, its hull barely visible in the beam of her powerful underwater flashlight. As Sarah descended, she could see emergency lights flickering weakly through the submarine's porthole windows. The Chinese crew was still alive, but their time was running out rapidly. Captain Liu Wei of the Chinese submarine Shenlong had been watching his air gauge steadily decline for the past 6 hours. The reactor cooling system failure that had forced them to surface for emergency repairs had also damaged their air recycling equipment. His crew of 7 men looked to him for leadership, but he was running out of options and running out of hope. When the sonar operator reported an unusual reading approaching from above, Captain Liu initially feared it might be an American attack. But as the reading got closer, it became clear that this was a single person in diving equipment. Against all odds and international protocol, someone was coming to help them. Sarah tapped on the submarine's hull, using the predetermined signal pattern that had been worked out between the 2 vessels, 3 short taps, followed by 2 long ones, followed by 3 short ones again. The international distress response code that transcended nationality and politics. From inside the submarine came an answering series of taps, confirming that the crew was conscious and aware of her presence. The rescue plan was complex and dangerous. Sarah had brought with her 8 emergency breathing apparatus units, each capable of providing 30 minutes of breathable air. The submarine would have to be partially flooded to allow the crew to exit through the emergency escape hatch, and then each man would have to make a controlled ascent to the surface while sharing air with Sarah. Working with hand signals visible through the submarine's periscope, Sarah guided Captain Liu through the process of preparing his crew for emergency evacuation. Inside the submarine, the Chinese sailors gathered in the forward compartment, their faces pale but determined. They understood that they were about to trust their lives to an enemy who had chosen to become their savior. The first man to exit the submarine was Petty Officer Jiang Ming, the youngest member of the crew at just 19 years old. As he emerged from the escape hatch into the freezing water, Sarah could see the terror in his eyes behind his emergency breathing mask. She took his hand and squeezed it reassuringly, using the universal language of human compassion to communicate what words could not. Together, they began the slow ascent toward the surface, pausing at regular intervals to allow their bodies to adjust to the changing pressure. Sarah monitored Jiang's breathing carefully, making sure he wasn't ascending too quickly and risking decompression sickness. When his emergency air supply began to run low, she shared her own breathing apparatus with him, their faces inches apart as they breathed from the same source of life. One by one, Sarah returned to the submarine to retrieve the remaining crew members. Each trip took tremendous physical and emotional strength, as she pushed her body to its limits while carrying the weight of 8 human lives on her shoulders. The water was so cold that her hands began to lose feeling, making it difficult to operate her equipment, but she pressed on with grim determination. By the time Sarah brought up the 6th crew member, she was beginning to experience signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. Her movements were becoming sluggish, and she had to fight to maintain focus on the critical safety procedures. But she refused to consider stopping with 2 men still trapped below. The 7th rescue proved to be the most challenging. Chief Engineer Wang Hu had been injured when the submarine's cooling system exploded, and he was barely conscious when Sarah reached him. She had to make a split-second decision about whether to attempt the rescue or leave him behind to ensure her own survival and that of the men already waiting on the surface. The answer came to her in Tommy's voice, echoing from her memory. "I always knew you were destined for great things, Sarah." She had made a promise to save these men, and she would keep that promise no matter what the cost to herself. Wang Hu was too weak to swim on his own, so Sarah had to carry him up through 180 feet of water while managing both of their breathing equipment and monitoring their rate of ascent. Her lungs burned with the effort, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced herself to maintain the steady, controlled pace that would keep them both alive. When they finally broke the surface, Sarah saw that a small rescue boat from the carrier had been deployed to collect the Chinese crew. The operation was being conducted in complete radio silence, with all personnel under strict orders to treat the rescue as classified information. The Chinese sailors huddled together in the boat, exhausted but alive, their gratitude evident despite the language barrier that separated them. The final rescue was Captain Liu himself, who had insisted on being the last to leave his vessel according to maritime tradition. By this point, Sarah was operating on pure adrenaline and willpower. Her body was shutting down from cold and exhaustion, but her mind remained focused on the task at hand. She had come too far to fail now. Captain Liu looked her directly in the eyes as they prepared to ascend together. Despite their different nationalities and the political complexities surrounding their situation, he saw in her eyes the same dedication to duty and human life that he valued in his own crew. Without words, he conveyed his respect and gratitude for her extraordinary courage. Their ascent felt like it took hours, though it was actually only minutes. Sarah's vision began to blur as they rose through the dark water, and she had to rely on her training and muscle memory to maintain proper procedures. Captain Liu, sensing her distress, took over some of the navigation duties, using his own submarine training to help guide them safely to the surface. When they finally broke through into the night air, Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense that tears mixed with the salt water on her face. All 8 Chinese sailors had been successfully rescued, and none had suffered serious injury during the evacuation. Against all odds, the mission had been a complete success. The rescue boat quickly collected Captain Liu and Sarah, and within minutes, they were back on board the USS Nimitz. The Chinese crew was taken to the medical bay for evaluation and treatment, while Sarah was rushed to a private room where she could recover from her ordeal without attracting attention from the general crew. Admiral Morrison visited her as soon as the ship's doctor had cleared him to do so. Sarah was wrapped in heated blankets, slowly warming her hypothermic body back to normal temperature. Her hands were bandaged where the cold metal of the diving equipment had cut into her skin, but her eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Chen, what you did tonight goes beyond the call of duty," Admiral Morrison said quietly. "You saved 8 lives at considerable risk to your own. That kind of courage is rare in any profession, but especially rare in circumstances like these." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Thank you, sir, but I think I got more out of it than they did. For the first time in months, I feel like I made a difference instead of just feeling helpless." "What happens now?" she asked. Admiral Morrison's expression grew serious. "Officially, nothing happened tonight. There was no rescue operation, no Chinese submarine, no international incident. The crew has been transferred to a neutral vessel that will return them to Chinese waters with no questions asked." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, you've just prevented what could have been a major diplomatic crisis while upholding the highest traditions of naval service. The Chinese government will know what happened here, even if they can't acknowledge it publicly. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never make it into the history books." The next morning brought news that would change Sarah's perspective on everything that had happened. A message from Tommy's doctor informed her that his latest tests showed unexpected improvement. The experimental treatment was working better than anyone had dared to hope, and his prognosis had shifted from terminal to cautiously optimistic. When she called Tommy to share the incredible news, he was alert and stronger than he had sounded in weeks. "I told you I was tougher than I looked," he said with something approaching his old humor. "And I had this amazing dream last night. I dreamed you saved a bunch of people who were trapped underwater, and somehow that made me feel strong enough to keep fighting." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "That's quite a dream, little brother." "It was more than a dream, Sarah. I could feel you being brave, and it made me brave too. I don't know how to explain it. But I know you did something important last night. Something that matters more than you realize." 3 weeks later, Sarah received emergency leave approval and was finally able to go home to be with Tommy during his recovery. As their plane lifted off from the carrier, she looked down at the vast Pacific Ocean and thought about the 8 Chinese sailors who were probably back with their own families by now. She never learned their names or what happened to them after that night, but she didn't need to. The rescue had taught her something profound about the connections that bind all human beings together, regardless of nationality or circumstance. In saving their lives, she had rediscovered her own sense of purpose and strength. Tommy met her at the airport, walking slowly but steadily on his own 2 feet. His hair was beginning to grow back in soft brown tufts, and though he was still thin from the treatment, his eyes held the sparkle of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen to live instead. "Welcome home, hero," he said as he hugged her tightly. "I'm not a hero," Sarah replied. "I'm just someone who learned that sometimes keeping your promises means doing things you never thought you were capable of." "Same thing," Tommy said with a grin. "But I'm proud of you either way." The official records would show that Lieutenant Sarah Chen had received a commendation for exemplary service during a classified operation. The unofficial truth was that she had discovered the difference between feeling powerless and being powerful, between surviving and truly living. between keeping promises to those we love and keeping promises to the broader human family we all belong to. Years later, when Sarah had been promoted to commander and Tommy had fully recovered and started a family of his own, they would still talk about that night in the Pacific. Tommy would joke that his dream had somehow given his sister the strength she needed to save 8 lives, while Sarah would maintain that Tommy's courage had inspired her own. The truth, as they both came to understand, was that courage is often contagious, spreading from person to person across impossible distances, connecting hearts and souls in ways that defy explanation. On a dark night in the Pacific Ocean, a dying brother's love had given his sister the strength to save strangers, and their gratitude had given him the will to keep fighting for his own life. The submarine crew never forgot the American naval officer who had risked everything to save them, and though they could never publicly acknowledge what had happened, they carried the memory of her courage with them for the rest of their lives. In a world often divided by politics and fear, 8 Chinese sailors and 1 American officer had proven that human compassion knows no boundaries and that sometimes the most important promises are the ones we make to people we've never met and may never see again.